Woke leftists have had a difficult time the past 2 years. The list of ordinary acts that are called covert white supremacy has been growing exponentially since the Trump presidency began, and as the widening divide over NFL protests show, the racially tinged culture war is just gaining momentum. Conservative media loves the liberal obsession with declaring innocuous activities as white supremacy because the wild headlines are red meat for talk radio and email newsletters. But mainstream right-wing commentary on these stories is amazingly shallow. Republican lawmakers use a standard soundbite comprised of an indignant denial of GOP racism, plus a preemptive disavowal of conservative racists. This earns them precisely zero credit with the media and the left. Conservative pundits lament the loss of common-sense American values, without offering any explanation for why those values have been in free fall since the 60s. The mainstream right seems to regard declarations of white supremacy as isolated incidents and politically foolish acts perpetrated by rage-filled progressives. The GOP is genuinely surprised every time they lose ground in the culture war to such seemingly ridiculous attacks. By declaring such attacks madness, conservative pundits absolve themselves of the responsibility to analyze and counter these assaults on whiteness. The mainstream right is not curious enough to track the progression of allegations of white supremacy, however, and the left does have a clever method to their apparent madness. Liberals begin an anti-white attack by condemning some distant act of racism, so that moderate whites can comfortably agree. Once whites have shown their willingness to concede a minor point, the liberal left rapidly moves the goalposts until those tolerant, progressive whites are themselves accused of racism. Let us use the symbol X to represent any white institution or activity. X could be sports, higher education, Hollywood, the music industry, or local government. The left's attacks will follow the same general pattern no matter what X represents. Using this alt-right guide to white supremacy, you will be able to not only understand the leftist tactic being used, you will also be able to predict for friends and family the next stage of white supremacy outrage. Whatever topic is selected for forced re-education is first attacked through its history. There is a legacy of racism in X, therefore the modern version of X must be made more inclusive and diverse. The politically correct white dupes, be they liberal or conservative, will then make an offer of support in good faith. The most powerful institutions and individuals will bend over backward to get non-whites to the front of the line in X. The changes implemented in the name of diversity lead only to decline in the quality of X, but guilt-ridden whites are willing to accept that if it means they are immune to charges of racism. Unfortunately, at this point, the totally unracist whites have accepted the basic premise of a historical legacy of racism, so they are now powerless to object when the institutional change that merely adds some diversity to white organizations is declared not good enough. At this stage of the attack, there will be a spate of headlines alleging that there is more work to be done. Once the accommodating whites have done everything possible to make X more inclusive, short of dismantling X altogether, they unexpectedly find themselves under attack for their very efforts at inclusion. Everything a white person does, including giving undeserved help and affirmative action to non-whites, is then classified as white supremacy. The institution X is then entirely taken over by non-whites, which means that X ceases to perform its stated function and is reduced to a wealth transfer program in which whites silently provide the money and managerial skill to facilitate their own decline. This process does not merely condemn whites for protecting their own interests. If you are white, even joining in the erasure of your own race is not good enough. The final stage in the white supremacy gambit is the open condemnation of whiteness itself as inherently evil. To review, first an institution whites invented is declared racist, next the diverse version of the institution is declared insufficient, then all the actions of whites become racist, and finally the mere existence of whites is declared a form of white supremacy. This last stage is quite a compliment when you think about it. People of color are so intimidated by the achievements and potential of whites that our very existence on Earth is de facto supremacy. Unfortunately, this also makes certain that real genocide will proceed at some point in the future. The white supremacy gambit clearly shows the inadequacy of GOP political philosophy. When a Republican talks about common sense, American values, or the Constitution, they are merely trying to avoid identity politics. But identity politics are inextricably linked to all the values that Republicans hold dear. The mythic age of common sense was just a time when the social norms that conservatives like were the dominant force in society, and American values can only be conservative to the extent that America is peopled by white Europeans. The Constitution itself was never intended to be the governing document for a heterogeneous country, made up of Muslims, Hindus, Jews, or Africans. If anyone had asked the founders to write a governing document for such people, they would have immediately created a white ethno-state. After America has lost its white majority with no resistance from conservatives, and the promised ideological conversion of non-whites fails to materialize, the few conservatives who are left will argue that the new Hispanic and Muslim cultural norms are just as American as the European traditions they replaced, because all the Muslims and Hispanics are legal citizens of the USA. The absurdity of this ideology is egregious. The politicians who claim to be conserving American culture will be praising totally different cultures and calling them just as American in a few decades. Accepting the infinite malleability of America and the universal applicability of the Constitution means that conservatives can never make a principled objection to any demographic or cultural change proposed by the left. The alt-right fundamentally agrees with the left's assessment of Western civilization. Shakespeare is white supremacy. Free speech and meritocracy are white supremacy. Math, logic, and science are also white supremacy. All of these civilizational attainments can only survive in a white European society that seeks its own interests without worrying about the hurt feelings of non-whites. As John Darbyshire has said, there must be something good about white supremacy because a few billion non-whites are desperate to move into white countries. Every attempt to exploit white guilt or redress racial grievances, no matter how innocuous and justified it may seem, eventually leads to the condemnation of whiteness itself. And that is the most intolerable thing of all.